Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us today for the Grasp on Robotics talk series. I'm Kostas Daniilidis, and I'm the faculty host for today's talk. Previously recorded talks can be found on our YouTube channel and website, and this talk will be there soon. You will have an opportunity to ask questions at the end of the talk, but also during the talk, you can raise your hand and we'll bring you the microphone. I'm very glad to introduce to you Professor Max Welling. Max Welling is a full professor and research chair in machine learning at the University of Amsterdam and a Merkin Distinguished Visiting Professor at Caltech. He finished his PhD in theoretical high-energy physics under the supervision of Nobel laureate Professor Gerard Hooft. He then switched fields to focus on machine learning. He was a postdoc at Caltech with Pietro Perona, and then a postdoc with another Nobel laureate, Jeff Hinton. He's a co-founder and CTO of the startup CuspAI in materials design. He's a member of the Royal Dutch Academy of Sciences, a fellow of CIFAR, one of the founders of the European Lab of Learning and Intelligent Systems, ELIS, where he's still on the board. Max is the recipient of many Test of Time awards, which is really the most significant awards in our fields. The Kundering Prize at ECCV in 2010, the 10-year Test of Time awards at ICML in 2021, and the Test of Time award at ICLR in 2024. He has 183,000 citations, one of the most impactful researchers on machine learning. And today he's going to talk about a new paradigm for scientific discovery. Max, go ahead.
Thank you very much. I hope everybody can hear me. Does that work? Yeah. Okay, so thank you very much for the introduction. I think the title I submitted was slightly different, but I will talk about uncertainty. So the first part of the talk will be more general overview of a new emerging field, which is now known as AI for science. And in particular, I will look a little bit at weather forecasting and materials, sort of material or molecule simulation and design. This is also part with work that's partly done at CuspAI, my new startup. And then the second half of the talk, I will emphasize the importance of uncertainty prediction and show you in more mathematical detail a new model that we have developed to predict uncertainty both for the partial differential equation prediction as well as for molecular force fields. So let's start. Indeed, it's a good idea to ask questions during the talk if you have any questions. So the first is a sort of part of the talk. I've given this part of the talk more often, but this is about the paradigm shift that is currently happening in the field of science. And in particular, this is due to the fact that AI is now starting to make an impact in science. So in the old times, or actually this is still happening a lot, which is people are inventing new materials by doing lots and lots of experiments and then analyzing the outcomes of these experiments using data mining or data science tools, some statistics, data got stored, analyzed, and with that people come up with new designs for new experiments, and that gets iterated. So what's happening, what's shifting is that part of the actual experiment can now be done in the digital domain. So you can actually simulate the molecular positions of a material in a computer. From that, you can already derive and predict lots of properties of that material. And so you can sometimes avoid doing the experiment, or at least you can find the most useful experiments you need to do in order to get yourself to a material with given properties. But of course, this is only possible due to the exponential growth of, or the exponential availability of compute power. But that's kind of the first step. I think the more important part of this transition that we're going through is actually the idea that we are now not that we are storing the information that's coming out of these simulations in big databases. And I'll say in a minute why this is important. So what we're going to do is we're going from this simulation now to emulation, which means that from the simulation, we get a lot of data that we store, and then we transform that information in that data, we transform that into a neural network predictor, let's say the weights of a neural network. So now the information is stored in the weights of a neural network. And then next time we're going to do an experiment, we're going to use this neural network to either predict the outcome or to accelerate the simulations that we need to do. So for instance, let's do an example. I'm a pharmaceutical company. I have designed a particular molecule, and I'm now going to test in digital domain, how well this, for instance, binds to, a particular cell. And so, or a particular protein. And so this is what we're going to do. We're going to simulate it, and we are not happy with the particular drug. So what we will do next time is we come up with a new molecule. And now the question is the new molecule, are we going to again do the entire simulation, or are we going to try to accelerate that simulation? And because we stored the data from the first simulation in a database, and we have turned this into a predictor, we can now predict the properties of a molecule much faster than if we would have not stored that data. So in some sense, the information we extracted from this is now being used to reduce energy, to reduce the energy we need to do to evaluate the properties of the next candidate. And it's this emulation loop, and the more simulations we do, the more experiments we do, the better our models become, and the faster this flywheel goes around. And so the faster we can simulate materials and we can search for new materials. Right, so, and this kind of holds through all of science. So we have definitely sort of science happening at the very smallest scales, which is particle physics or high energy physics. And of course, there's astrophysics on the other side of the space-time continuum, and everything in between, from chemistry to plasma physics to fluid mechanics to geophysics. All of these use very similar tools, either PDEs or simulators of some kind or other, that can be accelerated using the tools of machine learning. And so that's why we can truly view this as a new paradigm for scientific discovery. And I'll talk a little bit about fluid dynamics, and then I'll talk a bit about molecules. And molecules are particularly interesting because everything is made of molecules, and they're sitting at the interface between quantum and classical. Now, the first big, I would say, success story of AI for science started in, I think, 2021, around that time, when some groups around the world, including NVIDIA and Huawei and DeepMind, they started to train models on the enormous amount of meteorological data that was stored by the meteorologist. And that enormous amount of data made it possible to train very large, basically black box models. So these are typically models that are based on graph neural nets, or they're based on transformers, or in this case it was a Fourier neural operator. But the specific technology isn't all that important. All of these are about equally good. Of course, when we progress in time, they become better and better. But it is the fact that we can now train these models to predict the weather based on sort of basically black box models to predict the future state of the atmosphere, because that's really what we're doing. I was involved in this particular model. This is a model called Aurora from Microsoft Research. It was a model that was also trained on around 1 million hours of data. But I think the special thing about this model is that it could combine very different kinds of data sets. So we could take high resolution data from Europe and the US, and combine it with global, much lower resolution data. And all of that was kind of mapped into an embedding space. And in the embedding space, we basically predicted forward the future state of the latent space, and then we decoded it back to the state of the atmosphere. And that helped enormously. And one other interesting fact was that once you have trained a foundation model like this, and for instance, is explicitly trained on wind speeds and temperature and pressure levels and all these kinds of things, you can then, with relatively little effort, fine-tune or transfer, to a other problem. And that problem, for instance, in this case was air pollution. It wasn't trained on it, so this is NO2 air pollution. And with relatively small data sets, we could now train models that would predict air pollution. And on this side, you see two of these variables that we predict, like wind speed and surface temperature. And what was kind of surprising is that these models are starting to do better than the actual official numerical predictors like IFS, HRES. So these are kind of official numerical predictors, and these models based on AI are actually starting to do better than the numerical forecasts. Now, I would say there is, of course, a caveat, and that connects to the second part of my talk, which is it is very hard to assess what happens out of distribution. So if you encounter a new weather state you've never seen before, and of course, due to weather, to climate change, this might actually happen more and more often. It's hard to understand how well you can trust the predictions of a model like this. And so what we really need is also uncertainty predictions for these kinds of models. And I think this is a very active area of research. And so the second part, I also wanted to show some examples on molecules. So molecules are basically, at this particular energy scale we live in, everything is made of molecules except for some fundamental forces. And so once you understand molecules better and you have a better sense of how to manipulate them or design them, you can solve many of societal's biggest problems, including health problems like drug discovery, environmental problems and climate problems, like in this case, photovoltaics for better solar cells, better lubricants. 20% of the energy is being lost due to friction. Better catalysts. Many of the chemical things we make are made with the help of catalysts. Nitrogen fixation is a particular substance that helps with fertilizer, that is actually a fertilizer that's also very polluting to make. You actually emit a lot of carbon dioxide by making fertilizer. And finally, molecules for carbon capture, which is what I'm very interested in. I'll say a few more words about. And these are typically porous materials that capture the carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. Okay, so we go back to a little bit of sort of basic physics. I'm not sure whether the crowd here remembers from high school or had this, during their studies. But so this is a very rough model of a molecule. It's atoms that are bonded, that are basically connected by bonds. These are chemical bonds, and this is quantum mechanics, basically, that determines the strength of the bond. And so in principle, it looks quite simple to evolve the state of a molecule into the future, but there's a whole bunch of things which are tough about it. So the easy part is Newton equations. So 1687, basically these are Newton's equations, which say that the change in the position of each one of these atoms is given by their velocity, and the change in the velocity is given by the force. Now, the first big problem is to compute that force. You need to solve the Schrödinger equation, which was first introduced, well, the Schrödinger equation not, but quantum mechanics was first introduced by Heisenberg in 1925 in a paper, and later Schrödinger introduced the Schrödinger equation. That's a very difficult equation to solve. Solving it scales exponentially with the number of electrons, and there's many electrons that are in orbits here around this particular molecule. So that's the first problem. The second problem you have to solve has to do with chaos. In order to evolve this, even if you have the forces very precisely, you will have to overcome chaotic dynamics, and that's very difficult. The weather is also chaotic in a way. And of course, Lorentz was the first one actually in the context of weather that studied that. And finally, if you want to search through the space of molecules, in fact, this is also very hard because the space is humongous, it's exponentially or combinatorially large, and so searching through the space is also very, very difficult. Okay, so now I'll introduce some tools that are useful in AI for science, and in many of these tools I was also involved, and so you'll see some references to papers as well. So the first one is this idea that you want to embed some, I'd say, inductive biases or physical constraints into your neural networks, especially if you want to model a molecule. For instance, you know that the molecule is invariant, like the energy, for instance, is invariant under rotations or translations of the particular molecule. More generally, if you have a vector field, like a velocity field attached to each atom, you want that the forces or the velocities will transform properly with rotation and translation of the molecule. Now, if you just train a neural network, it will not understand that, you know, if you rotate the molecule, it will see very different numbers at its input. That's actually a rotated version of the input. It will just not understand. It just sees different numbers. And so in order to tell it that this is actually a rotated version, and for instance, certain properties should be invariant, what you need to do is to basically enforce, by constraining the weights in your neural network, the fact that if I would first translate the object and then convolve it or transform it in a neural network layer, it should come out the same as if I would first transform it and then translate the filtered object. If you make sure that this diagram closes, that you can do that by choosing special constraints on these filter weights. If you can make that happen, then you know that the neural network understands the symmetry transformations of the world. And that will save you a lot of data to train these neural networks, basically. If you want to read about this, this is a very good introduction. It's also online. It's written by Maurice Weiler. It's a great book. Actually, it's his thesis, but he's turned it into a book with lots of nice visualizations, and also the beginning is quite gentle to read. The second ingredient we need actually is a graph neural network. These are the students that have worked on this with me. The first step we needed to make is that, well, a molecule looks like a graph, but how do you do a convolution on a graph? This wasn't very clear, because the number of neighbors is often different, and also the ordering of the neighbors is arbitrary in a graph. And so we came up with solutions to do this, to basically satisfy a certain permutation symmetry in these graphs between the neighbors of the nodes. And this is called a graph neural network. Now, from there, we also want to put in the symmetries of the world. So we want to make sure that if we rotate the molecule and then transform it using a layer of a neural network, it should be the same as first transforming the molecule and then rotating the result. And again, we show that if you satisfy this particular commuting diagram, this constraint, then the graph neural network, which is actually a message passing neural network that sends messages between neighboring nodes, has the property of this equivariance and understands the symmetries of the world. Okay, so how is that used? So typically, the most important place where this is used is in a force field, but it's also in generative models it's used, but in a force field this is used. So what is a force field? A force field is basically a neural network that sidesteps the quantum mechanical calculation that you need to do. So I showed here that you need to compute this force. It's a quantum mechanical calculation, and we're going to replace that force by a neural network. So this is what we do here. And this neural network is now made of a graph neural network and an equivariant graph neural network. Now, it interpolates between two extremes, which were already known. We had, ab initio quantum mechanical calculations. Actually, there is an approximation of the quantum mechanical calculations called density functional theory. It's quite expensive still, maybe not as expensive as full Schrödinger equation, but it is still very expensive, so you can only look at very small molecules. On the other end of the spectrum, you can use classical force fields. So those are not very accurate at all, but you can at least simulate very large molecules. And these machine learning force field or machine learning interatomic potentials, MLIPs, interpolate between these two extremes. They can be as precise as DFT, and they can be as fast as these classical force fields. So that's one place where these graph neural networks and the equivariant versions in particular find a nice home to accelerate molecular dynamics simulations. The second one where equivariance plays an important role is in generative AI. So we all know generative AI from generating images and videos, which is in the news a lot. And so, yeah, you can generate videos of playing dogs, but you can also generate molecules with certain properties, right? And so if you want a particular drug or a particular material with certain properties, you can just ask this model to simulate or candidates or generate candidates for molecules which have the right structure and right properties. And this is related and connected to something which is called a variational autoencoder, which into so-called diffusion models. It's exciting because this is very much related to physics. It's actually a form of non-equilibrium thermodynamics. I won't go into this here, but we are finishing a book up right now that talks about that and that lays bare all of these different relationships. But a variational autoencoder is a model that takes like a complicated data manifold and maps it through a neural network and a sort of a final random number at the end to a probability distribution on code vectors or embedding vectors. And then that's the encoder. The decoder does the inverse of that, and they train to be each other's inverses, where we have a prior distribution, which is the perfection, if you wish, of the aggregated posterior, which is the mapping of all the points in the data space to the latent space. So the prior distribution from which we pick a point, and then we push it through the decoder to generate sort of data-like new samples. Now, what it turned out that this was a good idea, but if you want to create high-quality images, it turned out you need to put many more stochastic layers in between. And so this landmark paper in 2015 basically said that if I treat the encoder as a stochastic process, I don't have to learn anything about the encoder. I just treat it as a stochastic process where I increasingly add noise to the data distribution. And I then observe all these little transitions and make sure that when I go back, I train forces or vector fields that would drive at any point out of this kind of noisy blob back into a data point that lies on the manifold. That is a diffusion process. So this is a natural process that increases entropy, and this is an unnatural process, if you wish, that decreases entropy. And you need to put energy into this system. And this was mapped also onto stochastic differential equations. The math was very beautiful, and it also resulted in more efficient diffusion models. And so one example of how this is useful is, for instance, this work, already quite old, where you take a particular molecular pocket, a protein pocket, and you want to generate a ligand molecule, which is a drug-like molecule that fits nicely into the shape of that pocket. And here's a particular model, which was a rather long time ago, these models have evolved to be much, much better than what we did back then here. Okay, so then I'll say a few words about the CuspAI platform for material design, because we now have all the ingredients and all the tools that we need to talk about the platform. And so this was basically the idea of the startup came out of a worry about climate change and about global warming. So these curves are certain scenarios about emissions. We agreed that we will be carbon neutral by 2015 under the current geopolitical sort of situation. It is quite unlikely we will hit that. And so these curves are actually very optimistic, I would say. And these are the emission curves for CO2. So we need to get down in our emissions very quickly. But then one has to realize, and not many people do, is that after we hit actual neutrality, so no more net emissions into the atmosphere, we need about a century of negative emissions, which is capturing carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere. And we need to do this about half the rate that we are emitting it now. So these are gigantic amounts of carbon dioxide we have to keep getting out of the atmosphere for about half a century to a century. The amount of energy we would have to spend on this is enormous. And that technology really doesn't exist. And so we decided that we wanted to give this a try. And so the way we go about it is we build a platform that does automatic searching through the space of materials. And I would like to contrast that with the current way that chemists work to develop new materials. So there's a bunch of objectives, and then there's a chemist that reads literature and comes up with hypotheses for new experiments to do, and then starts to do the experiments. And maybe they also have a sort of a theory that they make, and then they start to do experiments, and then they keep doing this until they find something. So the platform that we're building is much more automated. There is a kind of an artificial agent that does the orchestration. There is an agent that goes read the literature, finds all the relevant information, both in the sort of unstructured literature body, but also the structured databases. It will then spin up a generative model, which basically means it will start to generate lots of candidates for materials with the right properties. It will then have lots of ways to test these properties, and these are property predictors and all sorts of other tests, but also much more expensive molecular dynamic simulations to compute all sorts of properties. And once all of that's computed, there's a very small list of candidates that's left over that then goes to the experimentation phase, for which new data is gathered and the cycle starts again. In this process, every one of these steps generates data that interacts with the central database, from which the machine learning models are constantly improved in order to go faster through this cycle every time. And so let me just go through a few steps for the particular project we did for carbon capture technology. So this is called porous materials or metal organic framework materials. This is one of the projects that we are running internally. And so the first step is generation. So we have built generative models for these beautiful molecules, which are called metal organic frameworks. And here you see 8 out of 500,000 of these materials that we actually generated inside the computer. And so the next step is then to evaluate properties. There's actually a large set of methods to evaluate properties, all the way going from ab initio quantum structure methods to continuum methods, which are mostly PDEs, like the weather model, and many things in between, like force fields, molecular dynamics simulations, particle-based methods, and lots of coarse graining. But what's interesting is that for any one of these methods, there's also a version that is in a machine learning accelerated version of this. So for each one of those, people have already started building ML accelerations. And it's often the case that, let's say a chemical method here will provide the data for a machine learning method here, and then a chemical method here will provide the data for a machine learning method here, etc. And so here's one example of a method which is called Grand Canonical Monte Carlo, where here you have your kind of porous material, which is the green part. And we are popping in sort of different kinds of molecules, and then we wiggling them around, and then we wait until they sort of get absorbed to the surface, the inside surface of this particular material. And then we compute the total loading. How much can we stick in there in a way? And then we do this as a function of pressure at a certain temperature, which gives us these what's called isotherms. So this basically says at very low pressure, very few molecules, if I start to add more molecules, more pressure, then the loading goes up very steeply. And at some point it's saturated, and then it's kind of the loading is much less steep. And it's this particular isotherm, which is a very important ingredient in computing how well this particular material would behave in, let's say, a carbon capture machine. Okay, so that's the cost part. And now I'm going to talk about something somewhat different, which is uncertainty prediction. Uncertainty is incredibly important in science, and especially when we use machine learning models for the simple reason that if you go out of domain, which, you know, for a physics-based model, you can be pretty certain it would still behave well. But for a machine learning model, if it goes out of a domain where it has been trained, there's no guarantee that it will give anything meaningful anymore. Yet most models that we are predicting, that we are using in this field and that make predictions don't come with this uncertainty predictor. And it's been puzzling to me why people are not focusing more on it. I guess there is one solution, which is what's called a ensemble method, which you basically train many models and then you use the deviations in these models as a measure of uncertainty. The problem is, of course, you will have to hold in memory many very large machine learning models, and you have to run all of these models sequentially or in parallel in order to get these uncertainty estimates. It's actually very expensive and not very practical if you want to do it at scale. And so together with Dario Kosha, we were developing, we asked ourselves the question, can we do better than this and build, let's say, machine learning force fields and integrate it for PDEs that have this uncertainty prediction at its core. And so the first set of models we tackled was autoregressive models, which are basically sequential models. So one of the important ones is, of course, PDE solvers, like weather models, but also fluid dynamics, like computational fluid dynamics solvers that take the state of a fluid and try to predict the future state of that fluid. Another version is, let's say, generative models for molecules. In this case, you would do it autoregressively, where you add sort of structures or atoms one at a time sequentially as you go through a molecule. This is supported by this called SMILES representation of a molecule, which is somewhat of it's a sequential kind of representation of the molecule, but it has very long range interactions because when you open a bracket, you'll also have to close it somewhere else. But once you treat this as a language, you can just use a language model to predict, to generate molecules. And so this is what we want to do. And the first model that we built was one for PDE solvers, and we call this BARNN. Okay, so the type of models in a slightly more detail, they look like this. So you have a sequential model where you compute the future state, let's say, of a fluid, given the previous state of the fluid and some parameters omega. And that's given by, let's say, a Gaussian distribution which has the mean as a function of the previous state and the parameters, and maybe some fixed standard deviation. So that's the transition model. The other one we've looked at is basically an RNN, where we first compute a sort of function h, a latent state or a hidden state, that is a deterministic function, like an LSTM or something like this, of the previous state and the previous h state of the model, and the parameters. So this is a deterministic function. It has very long-term memory this way. And then H is being put into a softmax to actually create the transition probability. And that's useful for molecules. Okay, so now how are we gonna make this probabilistic? And we want to make it Bayesian because we want to express the uncertainty. And so the way we do this is we say, well, the joint probability distribution over each one of the states and all the parameters factorizes as the transition probabilities for the states given the parameters times a prior over the parameter. So this is our model. And so written out is like, okay, here I have a state, let's say of the weather at time 0. And then I draw a bunch of parameters from a model. With those parameters and the previous state, I then generate the next state. And then again, generate parameters, and I take the previous state, and then I generate the next state. So this is the prior model that we're going to fit to the data. The way we're going to fit it is by this trick called variational Bayes. And if you haven't heard of it, the picture is if I have some complicated distribution, let's say the blue one, I am going to approximate this with from a member of a tractable family of distributions. And we're going to try to find the one distribution that is as close as possible to the complicated one. And we call this the variational posterior. And we're going to find it by minimizing the KL divergence between the tractable distribution and the true posterior distribution. And the good fortune is if you write out this KL, it basically, you can minimize instead what's called this evidence lower bound that's given by this expression. And you can actually compute it if you allow yourself to sample from this Q distribution typically. And so you can compute gradients and you can minimize this to find this distribution. And so what we do is we then posit a variational family for the posterior distribution over parameters given observations y. So now we have a bunch of observations y, and we replace the prior with a posterior distribution over our parameters. We're going to posit it's a product over time steps. And so what now happens is that instead of drawing my parameters from the prior, I'm going to draw it from the posterior, which I've trained, which depends on the previous state. So the previous state will give us input to a posterior distribution over weights. And then from that distribution, we draw the parameters for the transition probability to the next state. And now we can try to fit this Q to the data distribution. Now there's some details. I'm not sure how much time I still have, but I still have some time to talk about the details. The details are based on what we call dropout. It's a Bayesian or a interpretation of dropout, or a variational dropout, so it's called. So to remind you, dropout is this idea that to regularize a neural network training, you just kill randomly some of the neurons and the connections to and from those neurons, and then you learn the network to basically still do well in prediction, even if part of those neurons are gone. And sort of in this paper, we reinterpreted that as a Bayesian model, and we had all sorts of tricks to make it practical and fast. And so one of the important tricks is that you can interpret it as adding noise to the weights, but it has to be multiplicative noise. It's not additive noise. So that's already very important. So bigger weights have larger noise. We have learnable dropout rates. So the dropouts here rate was given, but in this sort of variational dropout, we can learn the appropriate dropout rates. We also, instead of actually adding noise to the weights, we integrate out the weights, and so they can be replaced by adding noise to the latent variables, and that turns out to be much more efficient. And I'll spare you precise details, but you can find them in this paper. And this turns out then the whole thing becomes an actual very efficient way of training Bayesian models. More details for this particular model that I talked about So here is sort of here are the parameters for layer L and time step t. They're given by a neural network alpha. So this is a neural network that looks at the entire history, has its own parameters, and predicts basically a scale value for the noise. Then there is a fixed omega, which we also learn, but it doesn't depend on t and it doesn't depend on layer, and it's a matrix. And then there is noise that we add, in this particular way with 1 plus noise from a normal distribution. If you choose this, the posterior distribution looks like this, and that you can see that the variance of the posterior is proportional to the mean. And that's an important sort of multiplicative Poisson-like process. Okay, so we have a prior. The prior can also written like this. And because the prior and the posterior have very similar expressions, the elbow actually becomes tractable and the whole update becomes very efficient. Okay, so those are some details. If you implement this, and so here's an example of solving a PDE. So here the PDE is called Kuramoto-Sivashinsky PDE. It's a one-dimensional one, and what you see importantly is that when the blue prediction starts to deviate from the ground truth solver, it understands that it's deviating because it is increasing its uncertainty in those regions where the deviation actually happens. And this basically means that the error is strongly correlated with the variance of the prediction, is exactly what we want. And so here is a particular experiment that we did where we compared to SMILES LSTM and LSTM for predicting molecules. We found that it scores much higher on these typical metrics like validity, diversity, novelty, and uniqueness relative to these other models. So it gives better models, which is already surprising, besides also giving uncertainty quantification, which these other models don't have. And it's also better to model long-range correlations, and it therefore generates more complex molecules relative to these other methods. And we don't know precisely why that happens, but sort of we see there's sort of two advantages. One is it trains better models, and two, it provides uncertainty quantification. And the second application of this is given by these machine learning interatomic potentials, or sometimes called machine learning force fields. These are these forces in a molecule that need to be predicted in order to evolve the molecule forward in time. And so we turned this into BLIP, which is a Bayesian learned interatomic potentials. And sort of the idea is the same, but the application is different. This is not a sequential model. This is just a prediction of forces, uncertainty over forces. So I have a molecule at input. I turn this into a graph. I have a neural network or a message passing neural network that predicts the forces on the graph. So here are the forces. And so now there is, okay, and that's given here basically. So there's a graph, it has a representation, a state, and then there is a neural network that predicts basically these messages, and then the messages combine to give you the next state. But that doesn't have uncertainty. So what we do next is we have another neural network that predicts the noise that we're going to add, or the scale of the noise that we're going to add. That's alpha and beta. And so we are now going to add noise proportional to this alpha. And for this other network, there's two networks involved in this message passing. We also predict the scale beta. Once we have those for every layer, we then add the right amount of noise to the parameters. We integrate out the noise. That turns into noise for the latent states. And then that will give you uncertainty for the predictions of the forces. And if we try this out, we compare to things like Deep Ensemble, which is more expensive, but it's kind of the state of the art at this point. Is what people use. There's a bunch of other methods as well, which we compare to. And we see that we make better predictions, and we see a high correlation between the actual error and the variance we predict, so the error we predict in some sense. And so that's what we want. The other thing is, so this is a much more complex molecule that we simulated. And what we see that if we train this with or without sort of this uncertainty quantification, especially for the small training set sizes, you see that the methods which add this extra kind of noise or this extra regularization, this Bayesian wrapper in a way, you can see that they really train better models than if you don't use it. And when the data set grows larger, then these models starts to behave around equally. Right, so that's sort of marks the end of the talk. In closing, I would say we are at the cusp of a new kind of paradigm for scientific discovery. AI is really changing the way science can be done. But most importantly, I find that by using AI, we can start to design new molecules and other materials that can help us tackle some of the biggest problems society is facing, including climate change, for instance, for new carbon capture materials, new sorbents, for the energy transition, clean energy, like say batteries, but also nuclear fusion. You need very strong materials for the reactor material. The environment, for instance, biodegradable plastics, but we also have projects running where we filter PFAS out of drinking water. Technological progress is driven by Moore's law and is therefore driven by semiconductors, which is a very important class of materials. We are running towards the end of the sort of silicon transistors, and so we probably need new materials, which is also where these kind of tools are going to be helpful. And of course, for health, for new drugs, let's say cancer drugs, for new vaccines, for the next pandemic that might hit, and antibiotics, we now have like bacteria which are resistant against certain antibiotics, and so we would also need a way to generate new antibiotics using these new tools. And that's it for me, and I'll end there, and I'll open the floor for questions.
So thank you, Max, for a very interesting and wonderful talk. Questions from the audience? We can bring the microphone to you, so hold on for just a second.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Thank you for the talk, really inspiring. You were talking about uncertainties, and I was wondering how well they are calibrated, or if there's some open problems there that you're still working on.
Well, there's still, you could argue there's open problems in the sense that this is just the beginning in a way. Let me see if I can bring up that slide. Yeah. So here, for instance, we do measure calibration when we test these models. I didn't give you all the details here, but in the paper you'll find lots of calibration measures to see that indeed the predicted uncertainty aligns quite well with the actual error it's making, the frequency of the errors it's making. Here you see one particular measure where we correlate the predicted variance with the actual squared error, and you want these two things to be highly correlated because you want large variance in your prediction to correlate with the high probability of making an error, which is happening. But in the paper you can find many more, but I think this is just the beginning. This is in some sense, apart from ensembles, one of the first methods that tries to take this seriously, and I think we can be much more thorough in actually testing the calibration. There's some good work from Rafa Bombardelli's group at MIT, and so I think one of the next steps will be to also work with him to try to test this more thoroughly.
Hi, Professor. Thank you for your speech today. I'm curious, what's your perspective on the interpretability of this black box models in science domain, because in those domains, these decisions can usually affect human life, such as weather forecasting and drug discovery?
Yeah, it's of course a good question. And when you talk to many scientists, they always like to have interpretability of their models. Now, there's a couple of things. So one thing is you can test models thoroughly and make sure that they get certified if they are used for important problems. And after all, I don't think anybody really understands every detail of a plane, and especially, you know, maybe there's engineers who understand it, but you and I who step on a plane don't understand it. Yet we do trust the plane because we know it's thoroughly tested and we've seen very few drop out of the air. So that's one way to start trusting particular models. But sometimes it's also good, and in fact, there's regulation in the EU that for certain predictions that affect humans, you need to give an explanation of why you took that decision. Let's say if you're denied a loan, you need to explain why you deny somebody a loan to keep things fair. And I think there is a set of tools to go from a particular neural network prediction to extract a explainable sort of say a summary of why the particular prediction was made. This could be a visualization, but it could also be sort of a language-based sort of explanation. Ultimately, you know, you could go for just don't use neural networks, but use symbolic models. That's kind of the ultimate solution if you want to really guarantee explainability. But ultimately, as a society, we may start to have to change our mind also a little bit, which is maybe it's okay to have some predictions which are not completely, you know, interpretable. If you go to a doctor and the doctor looks at a particular, you know, set of tests and has an intuition of what could happen, you know, what could be the underlying disease, possibly the doctor doesn't even know precisely why they are thinking or to make that assessment. And we are perfectly happy with that. So if I ask you, there is an AI doctor that is 99% the right answer, but can't always tell you precisely why, or a human doctor that is 70% correct, but can you precisely tell you why, then I would still think many people will go for the 99%. So we as a society may also have to change a little bit in the way we interact with AI in that way.
Yeah, thank you.
Hi, thank you for the very interesting talk. I really appreciated the vision and the impact of this research. But I was wondering if you could comment a bit on the feasibility of doing this research in academia as, say, a PhD student with limited resources. Like you are doing this in a startup, I guess DeepMind is working on similar problems. So, yeah.
I think it's totally feasible for academia to work in this. In fact, there's many academics who are working in this field. This is not LLM territory, right? So if you need to train models on the entire internet on 10,000 GPUs, yes, I can see the challenge for sure. But this is a field where data sets are typically quite sparse because it's very expensive to do these quantum mechanical calculations. So we need a lot of smart students to actually come up with new ways to train models on sparse data sets, come up with new ideas around uncertainty prediction, include physics in these models, right? So these models are, you know, some models are black box if you have a lot of data, but many models where there's not a lot of data, you may want to use a lot of your physics intuition and physics models to work together with the machine learning in order to become better models. And so there's a lot of ingenuity that can be injected in this research, and therefore it's actually quite ideal, I would say, for academic research.
I understand this, but I mean, maybe DeepMind is going to collect a bigger data set, train a bigger model, and then do better than whatever intuition comes.
But it's not always about doing better. So I don't like a race for bold numbers and tables, right? So if you come up with a smarter way to train these models on smaller data sets, they will be using your models to train on a larger data set, right? So it's maybe you shouldn't try to compete on who can train the biggest models with the most compute and get the bold numbers. How can you build better models that have better scaling laws and do well with smaller data sets, incorporate more physical intuition? And so there's a lot of problems that are very well suited for academia, and I'm sure the big corporates are very happy to use your research and scale them up to bigger problems, bigger models.
Hi, Max. Thanks for the great talk. I had a quick question about the side of like the material discovery. I was wondering what under the hood methodology you're using. Is it like some sort of like Bayesian optimization? If so, what flavor of it? Are you using something else that's like parallel to Bayesian optimization, not just like finalize what are the candidates that are ultimately going to be sent to like clinical trials and other things?
Yeah, so we indeed use two approaches. The one is pretty vanilla Bayesian optimization. There's, of course, a whole zoo of Bayesian optimization algorithms, and we try a whole bunch of them, and we pick the best one, but it's not rocket science. The other one is LLMs. So right now, there is LLMs, which are basically standard LLMs that see tools, that have tools available, and they see the tools in their context, so in their prompt in a way. At this point, the LLMs are not trained, but I would see that in the future, these LLMs need to be trained by kind of reinforcement learning in order to become smarter at this particular task. But that's kind of I think at this point, the state of the art. And again, lots of really interesting questions to train better models to do the optimization.
Thank you.
Hi, Max. Thanks for the talk. I kind of wanted to ask a more big picture question about, so for the uncertainty quantification, I think the application for like active learning or experiment design to more efficiently improve the model is pretty obvious, but I'm wondering what your thoughts are on different applications for this uncertainty quantification, and are there any current constraints that limit those kind of applications?
I think for me, I see three applications. The one is being aware of your uncertainty. For instance, in your kind of evaluation stack, you need to decide. It's kind of a multi-fidelity evaluation stack, and your Bayesian optimization algorithm needs to choose, or your agent needs to choose what evaluation to use at the current, material candidate that it's looking at. And so if there's still a lot of candidates around, you want to do the cheap things first. And but it's very good to know the uncertainty of the predictors that you're using, because if you know a window, let's say a property window, then you can just start to reason about, okay, what is the next level of tool that I should use to reduce this uncertainty more? And that allows you to do Bayesian optimization in a much smarter way, a multi-fidelity type of sort of Bayesian optimization. So for the optimization part, it's really important. And I kind of, there's sort of two of them in there. Let's see what else. Well, okay, and then the other thing is out of distribution prediction, basically. So if you build a tool and you want to bring it onto the market, you do want to make sure that, for instance, if you predict the weather and you see a sort of an outlier event that's very warm, sometimes you need to decide whether to evacuate people, which is very costly, or to do nothing, which could actually hurt lives. And so these decisions you take based on these models are typically heavily dependent on whether you got it right, the implications of that. And so having a sense of how certain you are about that prediction is important, because you could then say, okay, if I'm not so certain, I could actually switch to a much more expensive method to get more certainty, because my decision sort of depends on that. And so it will just help you reason about the outcomes of your predictions much better in general, I would say.
So I have one question, if I may. In the context of getting better uncertainty, how do you see the difference between automatic differentiation and machine learning based methods, especially when you want to go across the scale of microscopic to macroscopic models? There exist a lot of solvers specific at each scale that you could piggyback upon to compute uncertainties to synthesize new things versus short circuiting them with machine learning models, which might be better, but might also be more finicky to use and set up. Where is the balance?
Yeah, so I guess there's kind of two evaluation stacks, or I mean, there is methods which are rooted in physics at different scales. Actually, I had a picture of that. Let's see if I can find this picture back. So here,
Yes.
this picture, right?
Yeah,
so
this one exactly, yes.
yeah, so there's on the left-hand side here, if you can see this, but on the left-hand side here, there's basically a multi-scale set of tools which which are typically more expensive because they are physics-based tools. But as we go from here to here, become less and less accurate and more fast in a way, efficient. And so there is possibly, uncertainty quantification with each one of these tools. And then on this set, there is basically ML accelerations of those. And you typically find that, let's say, the equivalent, so let's say quantum neural Monte Carlo, there's a recent paper, for instance, like these Fermi net and the Pauli net and even Scala, these types of things, DM21. These are methods which are machine learning improved versions of these methods on the left. They typically, what happens is they have about the same accuracy, but they are much more efficient in terms of execution. So I would say you can just put them all on a big pile. Every one of them represents a method at a particular accuracy and a particular computational efficiency. And it is, if you want to, if you start with a huge pile of materials, you want to always pick the right tool at the right accuracy. Now, typically this means if you have trained your models well, you always go for these ones because they give you a much better trade-off in terms of the amount of accuracy you will get for the amount of computation you put in. But at some point, either because they may not have been trained enough, or you want a truly accurate answer, you have to go to the left or even go to experiment. I guess you get here somewhere. So there's also experiment here somewhere that you may want to do in order to get the final kind of ground truth answer, if you wish. But I would say all of these methods are in a toolbox for a optimization agent to exploit. And when it reasons, it needs to take into account accuracy versus computational efficiency.
Yeah, thanks. Any other questions? Okay, then let's thank the speaker again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you everyone for joining. We'll have a GRASS seminar next week again, so at 10:15 a.m. Thank you so much, Max. Wonderful talk and wonderful discussion.
Thank you very much.